Hello, good evening, and welcome to UCL. It is 6 o'clock on the spot, so I shall be starting at precisely the opening moment we sat down, and I'm delighted to see so many of you here in the audience, and also a welcome to those joining us online. My name is Uta Steiger. I direct the European Institute here at UCL, which sits in the Faculty of Laws, which is a fabulous faculty and co-convener of tonight's event. And so a wonderful thank you also to the faculty for hosting us, and to Disagreeing Well, which is UCL's campaign in this space. Tonight is the UCL Europe Lecture, which is an annual event that the European Institute organizes to invite thought-provoking, highly experienced and very interesting speakers to come from outside to our university and talk to our community and to our wider audiences about topics of interest and of relevance to today's Europe, broadly speaking. And I think tonight's topic and tonight's speaker couldn't be more topical if he tried. Now, if he allow me, you may have guessed this from my name. I'm German, and there's a wonderful term in German which is called Personalunion, which basically means somebody representing all kinds of different statehoods or areas of expertise. And I think Michael Ignatieff, who will be holding tonight's Europe lecture, does exactly that. He's managed to do several careers in one, which would have normally filled somebody else's rather successful lifetime. He's an academic. He is currently professor of history at the Central European University, but he was previously also at Harvard, Toronto, King's College, Cambridge, British Columbia, and elsewhere. And he has written 18 books, I understand, including one on Isaiah Berlin, and a whole range of questions that relate to tonight's discussion on academic freedom, state, democracy, sovereignty. And in this case, he is an academic authority on what he is going to discuss, academic freedom, what it isn't, and why it's under threat. He would also know this because he was also a politician. He was the leader of the opposition and leader of this Liberal Party in Canada, and so also knows a bit about the other side of those disputes as they come under threat. And that is also obviously a fantastic pool, I'm sure, of which he draws. Another area will be that of a university leader. He was rector and president of the Central European University between 2016 and 21, which was exactly the time it came under threat from the Orban government and eventually expulsed and ended in Vienna, where it is placed today. So I'm absolutely delighted he will speak to us today about academic freedom, and he will do so for about 20-25 minutes, after which we're delighted he'll be in conversation with our very own Professor Erin Delaney, who is the director of the new Centre for Democratic Constitutionalism, the Global Centre of Democratic Institutionalism, and whose scholarship sits very much in that space of constitutionalism in a comparative perspective. But as she will tell you a little later on, in her prior role at Northwestern University in the US, she also had quite a significant position working on questions of academic freedom for institutional leadership. So I shall leave it at this moment. You will get a chance to ask questions at the very end, but now I'm handing on to Michael. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. I feel bad for these folks at the back. I hope you can find a seat. There's some seats down front. I'm delighted to be asked to give this lecture, and want to thank Uta Steiger for organizing it. And I want to thank Professor Michael Spence, who's here, and the Vice Chancellor of Sussex University is here. It's a pretty classy room here. We got to behave. We got to raise our game, and Alan Delaney will be Aaron will be talking to me. So let me get going. My title, Academic Freedom, What It Is, What It Isn't, Why Is Under Threat, divides the subject up pretty clearly. I'm going to talk about what academic freedom is. I'm going to tell you what I think it isn't. And then I'm going to tell you why I think it's under threat. And then I hope we will have a vigorous discussion and vindicate academic freedom, i.e. you'll disagree with me, I'll disagree with you, and on we go. That's what we do in places like this. So let me start with what it is. Academic freedom for individuals, i.e. all of us in the room, all of us as members of an academic community, whether staff, faculty, or students, is the right to research, to write, to publish, and to make contributions to public knowledge and debate free of sanction. But which individuals? Only professors with tenure or the entire community? One of the immediate issues about academic freedom is who's it freedom for? And I think we need to be aware immediately that, as it were, some people have more freedom than others. I'm a tenured professor, as it were. The sanctions that can be leveled against me are not the same as the sanctions that can be leveled against an assistant professor looking for tenure or a doctoral student or a student. We need to be aware that we are a community, but with unequal status and unequal access to the freedom that we all profess. So that's just a problem I want to pose, and we want to have, to be a community, these freedoms should be, as far as we can, equal for all. And let me say something else about academic freedom. It is the value we profess, but here I am in ripe old age looking at you, a young audience, and I can honestly say that if the goal of academic freedom is to think freely for yourself, and I look myself in the mirror and ask myself honestly, have I thought freely for myself? It's been a damn struggle from beginning to end. I want to emphasize that. It's one thing to have freedom in some nominal theoretical sense, and quite another to actually exercise it. My intellectual life has been buffeted by fashions. I'm old enough to remember when discourse analysis, structuralism, Marxism ruled the campus, and I felt pulled and pushed by these fashions in discourse through my whole intellectual career, holding on to what I thought was true, holding on to what I thought was right, was a continual struggle. So institutions can guarantee you academic freedom, but all of you then face the burden of actually exercising it. And it's often a lonely, difficult business. So that would be the first thought. For the institution as a whole, so there's individual academic freedom, and then there's the collective freedom of the institution as a whole. It's the right of internal self-government, the right to allocate budgets to freely chosen priorities, to define and set academic standards, to recruit whomever you want to hire or accept as a student or promote as a member of faculty, to make partnerships with companies and other institutions, and to discipline the community, the faculty and staff and students, according to your own set of standards. The ideal of academic freedom is that we are a free, self-governing institution. Freedom from whom, though? Much of collective academic freedom for institutions is an attempt to answer or refute that adage, he who pays the piper calls the tune. And we know who the piper is. We know who calls the tune. The ongoing challenge to academic freedom in any country like the United Kingdom, where most of the funding comes from government, is to maintain sufficient freedom over the academic program, the setting of budgetary priorities, that you don't have the secretary departments of education dictating how universities make use of the money provided by the public purse. Also, there is the pressure of private money. I've taught at Harvard, and money, Bob Dylan famously said, money doesn't talk, it screams. Let me tell you, money screams at Harvard. And it can dictate and define what academic programs get chosen and adopted and funded. And that is also an enormous challenge to academic freedom. But both for individuals and for institutions, freedom is not unconditional. It's dependent on the discharge of responsibilities. In the individual case, and that means us in this room, it's the obligation to fulfill the responsibilities of scholarship and teaching within the canons of our disciplines. And those canons are not particularly permissive. They're enforced by departments, professional bodies, academic journals, tenure reviews, peer reviews. That's the constraint within which we accept to operate as individual academics. And in the case of institutions, academic freedom of the institution is governed by the responsibility to allocate public money to best effect, to give a public account of how the money has been spent. Ditto, to give a public account to private donors. It's a responsibility to maintain accreditation standards maintained by public authority. Universities and colleges, this great institution being no exception, are public trusts. And they're obliged to explain to the public, the taxpayer, how you spend and use taxpayers' money. And this responsibility, this dependence of universities and colleges on public and private money, is the wedge that politicians and private donors use to pry apart our academic freedom. Now, that's just an introductory set of notes about what academic freedom might be. What isn't academic freedom? And to start a little argument with you, get things going, here's what I think academic freedom isn't. It isn't free speech. Okay? It isn't free speech. As citizens of the United Kingdom, you have free speech rights protected in law, and you're entitled to speak as citizens on anything you want to talk about. Gaza, abortion, Ukraine, dignity and dying, you name it, you have the right to speak. But if you claim that right to speak, you're not claiming the right of academic freedom. Academic freedom is something different. Because academic freedom is conditional on speaking within the disciplines and terms of the knowledge in which you have some degree of expertise. It's not unlimited, unbounded speech. I've been a professor most of my life. Some of the most happy and satisfying moments of my life have been in a classroom. I am not entitled to say anything I damn well please in a classroom. I do not have free speech in a classroom. I do not have the right to tell you how to vote in the next election. I do not have the right to tell you my private opinion about Gaza. My job as a professor on the history of international law is to tell you what I think the Genocide Convention does and doesn't mean. That's sharply different from expressing my opinions about what has happened in Gaza, right? So I'm not free to say what I want in a classroom, and I shouldn't be free in a classroom because I have obligations to you as students. My obligation is to train you in the discipline that I'm supposed to have some experience of and expertise in. I have been, in a former life when I lived in England, I was occasionally called a public intellectual. And one of the things I learned about being a public intellectual is that it's an extremely dangerous role, because you're tempted constantly to opine on things you don't know a goddamn thing about. But you opine because you've become some kind of celebrity. And I'm talking about a very serious form of corruption that affects many academics. there are things we know and there are things we really don't know very well, but you get kind of tempted into saying, because you've got the gift of the gab and you talk and stuff. These are temptations. And as I got older, I become aware that academic freedom is a discipline. It's a set of constraints designed to reduce the amount of nonsense you talk in public and in classrooms. Try to stay clear and faithfully committed to what your discipline knows and admit freely and humbly what you don't know. And if you express your opinions as a citizen, you're entitled to express your citizens as an opinion, but you're not entitled to claim the authority of University College London, Harvard, all the things that I would love to speak on. Every time I open my mouth, have people think, well, he's a professor at Harvard, therefore what he says has authority. Only if I'm consistently within the disciplinary competence that gives me authority. So I'm talking here about the authority of speech and trying to distinguish between the free speech rights we have as citizens, which require no authority at all. You don't have to have authority to say what you think and believe. You have the right to speak for yourself. But as an academic, I have an obligation to speak in terms of the authority that has not been vested in me, has been earned by me after 25 years of patient study of a particular discipline, right? So, and I think sometimes we've forgotten this stuff, and with the consequence that we have eroded our authority as academics. So, now that's what I think the distinction between free speech and academic freedom may help us to understand. For institutions, the academic freedom of being a free, self-governing institution is not inviolate. It comes with substantial responsibilities that I've already indicated. Accountability to public authorities for public money, and if you had leadership positions in universities, an accountability to the institution and the community itself to uphold its standards, its commitments. And that leads me to believe that the question of whether a university like University College or Harvard or the University of Toronto, where I was trained as an undergraduate, should take collective positions on issues of public controversy, I tend to incline towards what's called the Chicago position, namely, universities are under no obligation to, and in fact prudently should not take public positions on issues of public controversy. Everybody feels passionately strongly about Gaza, for example, but I think it's inappropriate for a university to take a collective position on the Gaza issue, as painful and horrifying as that issue is in all its complexity. And one reason for that is we are a plural community. You cannot assume that everybody in this room thinks the same damn thing about this issue. It's a complicated issue, a horrifying issue. But a university has to respect the plurality of the opinions of the members of the community make up for it. That's one reason, I think, why universities should not take public positions on matters of public controversy, simply to respect the plurality of opinion within the community itself. Secondly, because I think what universities pronounce publicly doesn't make a goddamn bit of difference, to be perfectly blunt with you. Having been a president of a university, I just think we massively, pathetically overestimate our influence. And mostly because I think we need to respect the plurality of disagreement and respect the plurality of disagreement within our own communities. Okay, now let me go to the third element here of why I think academic freedom is under threat. One reason that I think we know many of the reasons, and we can even identify some people who are giving us a hard time, so that's not hard. But I think one of the things we don't talk about enough is just how powerful universities have become in my lifetime. In the revolution in global academic life needs to be noticed. In 1965, in the United States, the percentage of the U.S. population with college degrees was under 10%. It is now close to 40%. That's a revolution. In the position of the university in society, a drastic increase in the influence that our role as credentialers and formers of future middle-class professions. And the same thing is sort of true in Britain. Less than 4% of the UK population had a college degree in 1965 when I first entered university. And now the percentage is somewhere up towards 24%. Again, it's revolutionary. This explosion in recruitment, explosion in the size of universities, has given it enormous power in society. At the same time, universities have become, particularly in their science departments, very powerful engines of economic growth and opportunity. In many communities now, universities are the biggest employers in a given city. So these are institutions that have a salience and power that they did not have in 1965. Any institution that acquires power and salience becomes a target. That's my point. It becomes an object in the political struggle. It's no longer an ivory tower. It's an engine of economic growth, an engine of mobility, a credentialing institution that also, crucially, reproduces inequality. All the studies show that the biggest single marker of inequality in American society, for example, is no longer social class or race, but whether you have a college degree or not. Okay? So suddenly the university, which thinks of itself as kind of neutral promoter of the social good, is now being blamed for credentialed inequality and its consequences for society. This is creating enormous resentment, some of it perfectly justified, at the power that we in these institutions exercise in determining who gets a chance at a great life in Britain and America and who sits on the sidelines. And you can imagine the resentment of those who don't have college degrees. If 40% of the American population has a college degree, that's a revolution from 1965. But remember that 60% of the population doesn't. Okay? And you begin to understand some of the convulsive resentments that universities are beginning to stimulate and create, despite all the attempts that universities have done to stand for improved opportunity. We've sold ourselves to the American and British public as we're the ticket to hope, right? And that has worked for millions of people. But those who didn't get the ticket to hope are often extremely resentful of the privileges that college education has opened up for those who have got the ticket to hope. The other thing I want to refer to the great philosopher and profound thinker Steve Bannon, whom some of you will know is one of the kind of philosophers of the MAGA revolution. But Steve Bannon, who's a scary guy in every way, said something very interesting, which I think we all need to reflect upon. He said, culture is upstream of politics. Think about that. Culture is upstream of politics, meaning those who control the institutions of a culture will control its politics. If universities are central, powerful institutions of culture, and you want to take power in the United States, you have to take control of those institutions. If culture is upstream of politics, the way to control politics is to get control of the cultural institutions that determine elite recruitment and determine elite definitions of competence, determine elite definitions of public policy. Bannon knows exactly what he's talking about. He's defined exactly why it seems to me universities are vulnerable. They're also vulnerable for another reason, which is very complicated here. Attacking elite and entitled universities is a surrogate inequality strategy. It's much easier to attack Harvard than to attack the super rich barons of the new internet economy. So you go after Harvard, it's a much safer topic if you want to stir up resentment than it is to take on the galloping inequality of an AI-enhanced economy. And it's much more effective to go after Harvard or University College, than it is to go after the deep-rooted structural generators of inequality in our society. And so the key strategy, which I watch with astonishment, is the ways in which the idea of academic freedom has been ripped out of the hands of its actual defenders and turned into a battering ram to humble and humiliate universities. Harvard is being accused of anti-Semitism. I spent 15 years of my life at Harvard, and the accusation that this is an anti-Semitic institution makes me dumbfounded with astonishment. The bad faith involved in this accusation is a scandal. And the claim is that an anti-Semitic campus is hostile to the intellectual and academic freedom of its members. And you think to yourself, what planet are they talking about? But that's simply to say, this is politics of a raw and a relentless kind, using the language of academic freedom to strip academic freedom from the institutions themselves. I've never seen anything like that in my adult life, and it is terrifyingly successful at the moment. I was present at the beginning of this kind of ideological maneuver in 2017. Viktor Orban, the authoritarian prime minister of Hungary, from one day to the next, in order to win an election, decided to render the university that I was honored to leave, Central European University, to render it illegal, to use the law essentially to make it impossible for us to grant our American accredited degrees in Budapest. And I think Orban in 2017 showed the entire Republican establishment, Steve Bannon included, what the game plan is to use the university as a battering ram, not just against universities, but soon against a much broader target, which is liberalism, the rules-based international order, human rights, free trade, globalization. It's very important to see the attack on university as part of a much wider, much more broad-based, much more systematic attack on what I think could be called the liberal order. It's not an attack on the power of the media corporations that dominate the public realm. It's a diversionary strategy that attacks one target in order, in my view, to protect another. Now, and so we've never been in a situation in my adult life in which academic freedom has been deployed to legitimize an extortion strategy directed at the leading institutions of the United States, an extortion strategy whose purpose is to extinguish academic freedom itself. This is a very serious and grave situation. And then the question that everybody in this room will ask is, could it happen here? Europe, I'm a Canadian. Could it happen in Canada? Could it happen in the UK? Could it happen in other European societies beside Hungary? And of course it can. I will not comment on British domestic politics, but I've heard some discussions that this threat is not a million miles away. And so we all need to wake up and acknowledge, I think, one of the vulnerabilities that every vice chancellor and president understands, which is if you have a university sector which has very good reason to be proud of itself, UK universities are some of the very best in the world, including this one. So you've got good reason to be proud of yourself, but you have a structural dependency, which is a fearsome problem. You're incredibly dependent on state subsidy and state subvention and public finance. And Trump has written the book about how you use the NIH, all the public funding bodies of American scientific establishment, to basically cripple a university. So the tools are there to do enormous harm. And I don't know whether you should prepare for it, but you need to think the unthinkable here, which if it is happening in the United States, it could happen here. And you're vulnerable precisely because we're so important. Shed the idea that how could it be happening? Universities just do their little thing. No, you're massively powerful, important social and political institutions, and that's why you're being attacked. So you better be smart and defend yourself courageously. Let me come to a conclusion because I've gone on a little longer than I thought. Universities are vulnerable also because democracy is vulnerable. One of the things that shocked me as a ex-politician you have to lose in politics to really love politics, and I lost badly, but my experience of being in practical politics was to have a very great and enduring love of democracy for all its weaknesses and fallibilities. But the thing I've noticed is that democracy has no natural constituency, partly because democracy is an argument about what democracy is. The democracy that I understand is not majority rule, but majority rule balanced by minority rights, checks and balances, rule of law, the power of above all, free media. And so democracy, properly speaking, is what I teach my students, is power checking power to keep the people free. The goal of democracy is freedom, and not freedom wholesale, freedom retail, your freedom, her freedom, her freedom, her freedom. And your freedoms will be very different. You have different life projects, different views, different things you're willing to spend your life doing. And the democratic society exists to make that individual freedom possible. And we've somehow forgotten a lot of that. A lot of people think the goal of democracy is justice. I'm not so sure. I think the goal of democracy is freedom. Immediately you can see there's an argument here. And this is the argument we're having. And people get tired of the argument. That's the thing that frightens me a bit. Get tired of the internal argument about what democracy is. And they're very tired of being told what's true and what's false. And the whole function of academic life is to say, you say X is true, but actually we've done some research, and I'm afraid to say it doesn't pan out. We're the bearers of very disagreeable bad tidings. We're constantly checking opinion and testing it against what we think is reality, and that awakens admiration from some, but fury in others. We're a counter-majoritarian institution. That's what it is to use knowledge. It's to use it in a counter-majoritarian way in the interests of human freedom. Tough for universities to do. Nothing is more important. And whatever else we disagree with, I hope we will agree in fighting passionately for a counter-majoritarian institution like ours, committed to the relentless, rigorous, committed pursuit of truth. Thanks for your attention.
Go ahead.
Hi. Thank you. So let me start by offering some explanation of why I should be able to talk, understanding that we need to justify our expertise. So in this context, I am speaking in part because I served as the chair of the President's Advisory Committee on Free Expression and Institutional Speech at Northwestern, which then President Schill constituted and ran sort of the year starting up a few months after the October 7th atrocity and going on through the rest of the year, including while President Schill was called before the Education and Workforce Committee in the House of Representatives to answer to that committee about his actions at Northwestern in response to the protests around Gaza. And so we worked together on this committee, a group of us over 8 or 9 months, to produce a statement on free expression and institutional speech. So therein lies my claim to credentialing. It may not be sufficient, but it is at least something. And my job now is to find something to disagree well about. And that's very difficult to do because so much of what you said, I'm sure we all agree with, and I certainly agree with. So what I'm going to do is ask you some questions to try to find something that we can disagree about, and then we can model how to do that very well, which is the idea of the event. I'm not sure we will, but let's try. So there's so much to discuss, and I think, why don't we take institutional speech to start with, and then we can go to individual, because I think that might be harder. We might have more to agree on institutional speech. So the Chicago Principles position, which you stated, is institutional neutrality, that the institution should not engage, take sides in really anything in order, as you said, to promote pluralism. And so my question to you is, how do we square that position with the way you ended your talk, which is that we as universities actually need to do something very dramatic in the face of what is coming, what is staring at us? And where is the line there between institutional neutrality and the kind of what sounded to me like it was an aggressive promotion of university values, which will be viewed as putting your thumb on the scale on an issue of public debate?
Right. Well, I think the Chicago position, as I understand it, is you don't take positions on issues of public controversy, but a university will and must take positions when it's facing existential threat to its operating values and commitments. So Harvard didn't take a position on a lot of public issues, but it has taken a collective position on the Trump demands, because it believes, I think rightly, that these are an actual existential threat to its capacity to operate and its capacity to. So essentially, the only thing on which a university should take a collective position, and I'm aware this is a controversial thought, is it's defending its own academic freedom, right?
At what
stage?
And
for many students and for many people passionately engaged in and stirred up by political controversy, this is a difficult issue, but it's a self-denying ordinance with a real purpose.
So what stage? So Trump, the gun is to the head, right? The NIH money has been taken back. If we are saying in another context, for example, hypothetically here, right, what would we want to do now to avoid being in that situation in some undetermined number of years, right? What could the university do? How far out ahead of an existential threat does it have to be? Is it okay to say, we're concerned about, should Harvard have said Project 2020, we're concerned about the provisions in this back during the election.
Yeah. Well, Project 2025, for those who don't know, was a comprehensive kind of guidebook or operating manual for the Trump counter-revolution, and it was preceded the election, and people studied it and thought, and anybody who studied it said, "Whoa, brother, look what's coming," and much of it has come. So I can see the case. Yeah. I think this is a very difficult issue about political prudence. I don't know that it's an issue of principle. That is, I'm aware that I'm looking at two senior university officials here who have to. That's what we pay you the big bucks to decide. Frankly, I don't have a view. Why? Because if you came out in September 2024 and said Project 2025 by this American Enterprise Institute is a potential massive threat to the universities, and we need to resist it, that may bounce in funny ways. It may make your problems worse. It may make people say, well, okay, let's go at them doubly hard. So this is what I mean, that it's a judgment of political prudence. I don't think I have an answer in principle.
As we were working through our statement, leaving space for the prudence of leadership was one of the important things. And so leaving a little bit of space between, an existential threat and a threat to the interest in operations was designed to provide that prudence, but it's hard to understand how it's exercised. I wonder if you could speak more about the self-definition of the university. So, for example, do you think the fact that universities are engines of the economy, provide tremendous social mobility? I mean, the GI Bill in the United States transforms the university, right? Is that something that university leaders should be leaning into and justifying? So we produce this amount of GDP, or is the error not going back to we exist, in the words of our statement, universities exist to pursue knowledge in the service of truth, right? Have we lost that goal by focusing on output?
Yeah.
And how would you balance those two questions?
Yeah. That's a good point, which is what a person says when he doesn't quite know what to say in reply.
I'm just trying to find something to disagree.
And my instinct is that an economistic emphasis on job creation, innovation, all this stuff, paradoxically leaves much more exposed the stuff that pisses people off, namely that we're always arguing and fighting and let's also be honest, and I'm in the humanities. I'm not in the hard sciences, and I'm in history, which is, as everyone knows, the master discipline. But God Almighty, academics talk a lot of crap, and some of it gets out in public, and some of it's embarrassing. So we have to own our own embarrassment at times. We have to say, listen, we're immensely proud of our disciplined search for truth. We're immensely proud of the fact that we're a kind of community that believes in one thing, which is to get the answer right, the best of our abilities. We think this is good for a society, and we want your children to come, and we want to teach them that. But God Almighty, we say some pretty stupid things sometimes. I think there's a kind of a modesty here about knowledge, which is just essential. And I think we do need to separate that from this economistic stuff. I was doing some of that economistic stuff on the platform because it's manifestly true. I mean, there have been some moments, quite recent moments, when, for example, Oxford pairs up with, what is it, big pharma to get the RNA vaccine out quickly, and did it, I think, in an absolutely model way. And I think it's appropriate for a university to say, do you understand how Oxford was able to do that? Because we spent 35 years looking at vaccines in places that nobody cares about, right? And we know something about vaccines because we've invested in this apparently useless technology. And then suddenly in 6 weeks, we can sequence and get a vaccine that saves millions of lives. I think it's appropriate for a university to stand up and say that as loud as we possibly can. But having said that, we've got to get back to our main business, which is we sit around in coffee shops and seminar rooms, and sometimes we talk a lot of crap. And we got to be honest about it and self-critical and not oversell it, but be proud of this discursive thing that we've been doing, by the way, for 1,000 years. That's another thing to say. I feel this very strongly in European universities because you're constantly going to a place like Padua, and you come around the corner and you realize the university's been there since 974. And, you look at the people, who taught there, and suddenly you're looking, my God, Galileo taught here, right? It's just, when you ask me why I'm proud to be in universities, a lot of it has to do with that. We've been around a very long time, and we've lived through tyrannies, we've lived through revolutions, we've lived through moments of collapse and disgrace. We're still standing. We're among the oldest self-governing communities on earth, or in Europe, let me put it that way. And so that sense of collective pride is important. And that's another reason why the economistic language misses the historical depth of the university as an invention.
Sort of both and.
Yes, both and.
And maybe leaning in a little bit to that is sort of search for pursuing knowledge in the service of truth would allow us to return some love to the humanity.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And it's not just the economic values. But you said something else about epistemic humility, and I want to circle back to this because I think it's another point that we're agreeing on, but we could develop a little bit more because I think it raises real questions about internal incentives in the university. So there's a book about how the elites fuel populism, and some of the content of that book focuses on this idea of sort of the public intellectual, the TED Talk giver, the person that wants to have, dare I say it, impact with their scholarship. And that some of that leads to undermining the value of the university precisely for the reason that you already mentioned, which is that epistemic humility requires us to retest, to understand that we have knowledge now, but that knowledge may not yet be truth, right? And so, the replication crisis in the sciences and all these other parts that have led to the undermining of that university endeavor. How should we think about what Tarun Kaitan and other people call scholactivism? How should we think about, so that may be at one side, how should we think about the expectation within a university to have impact, to have political impact? What can you have impact in the same way in every discipline? And there was one article that was cited in this book suggesting that university press releases are one of the main areas where information kind of gets flattened and the nuance is left and it gets oversold. And that so it might even start from us ourselves and our efforts to get this impact.
Boy, oh boy, I find it difficult to say something sensible, and having just confessed that we talk a lot of crap, I don't want to add to the volume here. But an epistemic humility is, we all like that until somebody challenges our 15 years of research, and humility goes out the road, and we pound the table, and we know what we know. So I'm not sure epistemic humility is a game plan for a university. A university has to defend what it achieves and what it stands by. I think that the other thing that we're all really struggling with in terms of impact and all these things is just the social media explosion, the total transformation of the technologies that diffuse and spread information, belief, and opinion. I was thinking back to being a child in Ottawa, Canada, in the 1950s, and remembering what the information stream when I was a little boy. I'd go out on the stoop and I'd take the newspaper into my dad, he was a civil servant, and he would read the news, and then he would listen to the radio, and it was a public broadcaster. And with the newspaper and the public broadcaster, he basically had the story for the day. And then because he was a civil servant, he actually went in and could get the New York Times later in the day. But you can't recreate this world. And a lot of the authority of the academy reposed on an ecosystem of information knowledge that's vanished. And so we talk a lot about impact in a situation where every single one of you in the room could have a Substack. The cost of entry is zero, right? Have your opinions and spread them out and earn your audience, and God bless you. Actually, I mean, I have a Substack. I love getting a little audience going, but we're all concerned with impact and haven't, I think, thought hard enough about authority. What is intellectual authority in a social media world? How do universities defend the idea that there is some authority in our disciplines? Some things actually turn out to be reliably true. Some things turn out to be reliably false. And to the degree that we have any authority, it's because we're better than some people at distinguishing between truth and falsehood in specific bonded fields of knowledge. But this authority is under constant, relentless attack of a kind I don't think we've seen in my lifetime. Some of the world we've left reinforced authority in all the worst ways. I'm not nostalgic for the lost information world we were in, but God Almighty, we don't understand how to operate in this one. And I think we talk too much about impact and not enough about authority. And I don't like it when universities are, pressing young assistant professors to display impact and start measuring their the number of op-eds they've written. You just think, give them a break here. What matters is to help a young scholar get authority in their discipline. And be someone that you go to, because I can trust this woman. She knows her stuff all the way down. That's what we need to be. Less impact, in other words, more authority is my kind of, I don't know how that translates in operational terms, but if I was the head of a department, I'd be interested in hiring and promoting people who have authority in their discipline, not impact. I mean, if impact comes, good. If it doesn't, so what? I'm haunted by the story told by our provost president about John O'Keefe, a scientist who won the Nobel Prize, despite having spent an entire lifetime being turned down for grants because people thought his particular field of expertise wasn't fundable. Well, that's a story to give every university president pause, because you really want to have an academic culture in which you're encouraging John O'Keefe to just keep on going. Don't worry about impact. Don't worry about grants. We're here for you. We think this is you're just a hell of a smart guy, and very few universities are doing that, unfortunately. And so that's why the academic freedom discussion is so interesting, because it's a very cruel mirror that casts a very sharp reflection back on us. I don't want to have anybody in the room go out in the night all crutched in apologetics about university. I'm proud of being in a university. I love university. I passionately believe in them, but we really do need to look in the mirror.
So something you said here was about trust and the idea of creating trust in what it is that we do by relying on sort of expertise, but also authority.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about that, the necessity of that trust, or of the university as a knowledge institution to democracy more broadly, because you were sort of touching on it, but that is also the one claim that we could be making, right? That we are, as a knowledge institution, essential to your version of democracy, which I might call democratic constitutionalism, but
hey,
I mean, we're disagreeing.
Well, it's a professional deformation, Aaron, but we gotta know. The trust issue is enormously complicated by the social media revolution. I mean, all the the wonderful historian of Gutenberg, Elizabeth Eisenstein, made this point 30 years ago, but it seems to me so true that Gutenberg has this deep connection to the Protestant Reformation and to the empowerment, not to the creation of the doctrine, but to the empowerment of the doctrine of the priesthood of all believers. But part of the priesthood of all believers, this relates to trust, is trust nobody but your own reading of the Bible, right? There's something very, the Protestant Reformation, goes at the Catholic Church, but some of the Protestant Reformation's most revolutionary impacts is fragmenting the authority of the Protestant churches. So, it creates this world in which Luther empowers people to think, I can read the Bible in the vernacular. Fantastic thing. I mean, a revolutionary moment in European culture. The printing press then allows people to get the Bible in cheap editions. And that in turn then creates a new consciousness about trust. I don't trust anybody but my own reading of the Bible. And I think we're living through something like that now. That is, a lot of the epistemic authority that universities built their empires on for hundreds of years is now being sundered by a democracy in which we're all part of the priesthood of all believers. I will decide what my truth is. I will decide what's true. And some of that is actually fantastic. This is what makes it complicated. Mob rule in epistemology is not 100% negative, but all forms of mob rule are dangerous. And we're in a situation where the trust that people had reflexively in, if Harvard said it or if UCL said it, it must be true. All of that's under unprecedented challenge, because all of us carry the equivalent of the Library of Alexandria in our pockets. This is a completely unprecedented revolution. We don't need to ask a professor X, Y, or Z. We can get it. We now even just can talk to it. So what do you do? I mean, I think the hopeful answer is that the truth testing functions of universities have never been more important ever. But the trust in that function is lower than ever. So the role is more important, but it's more fragile. And that's why the authority question is what matters to me enormously. to work very hard to sustain and reproduce our authority as sources of truth. So, yeah.
So maybe one or two more questions just on the earlier topic about individual academic freedom and how to balance that. And maybe this connects to the idea of authority and the discipline. So, and this is an example from Northwestern. So a famous Northwestern example of Arthur Butts. So Arthur Butts is a Holocaust denier, wrote a book called The Hoax of the 20th Century after he received tenure at Northwestern, but he was tenured in the electrical engineering department. And so the question is, right, when he spoke and referenced his Holocaust denialism in class, it was very easy to say, this is not part of your disciplinary area. This is not what we hired you for. Now, it created a complicating factor for students. And so there wasn't a big process, but the president at the time ensured at the department level said, you better ensure that if he's teaching a class, there's another section so that people can choose. They don't have to take his class. But that wasn't a policy. That was just sort of managed. Okay, so now, and this is an example from my friend and former colleague Eli Finkel, who runs the Center for Enlightened Disagreement at Northwestern. So sort of the same idea as this. He is in psychology. So he said, now instead of Arthur Butts, electrical engineer, talking about the Holocaust, you're just in an introduction to psychology class, and the professor has decided, it could decide a number of things, decides to talk about questions of racial distinction. That's one possible. Decides to talk about research into questioning the way in which people experience their sexual orientation or whether or not they're transgendered.
Mm-hmm.
Is this okay? Is this okay to present the results of some of this material? Should it be a topic for conversation? If the professor does not include those, and a student says, oh, but I have, what's the professor's responsibility in responding to that student? Do students have academic freedom to ask questions in class raising these kinds of topics when they themselves have yet to be inculcated into a disciplinary? So to me, the rubber meets the road with these ideas almost always in the classroom, because you have to make tough choices about what you include in your syllabus.
Fine. Yikes.
This is why it took us a year to come up with ours.
I think it depends enormously on context and content. On the psychology of gender, for example, the trans issue is enormously fraught and enormously controversial. But I think there are things that we can know about the trans phenomenon. There are some facts about the phenomenon. There are some facts about what the trans phenomenon tells us about gender more generally. I think it depends massively on how this is presented. Depends, if you turn this into a kind of ideological polemical issue, I think it's a mistake as a teacher. I think you want to simply, my analogy is that there's a fraught parallel. But because I teach the history of international law, there isn't a semester in which I don't get asked whether genocide occurred in Gaza, right? So, and all I try to do is say there's a thing called the Genocide Convention. This is a piece of international law. You've got to understand what this document says, right? And then I also make another point, which is more polemical, and this is where I'm at the edge of whether it's acceptable. And I think students in the audience need to understand how difficult this is for professors. I mean, it's not as if, I'm not sitting here telling you I know what the right answer. The one thing I try to say is that genocide has a meaning in international law, and it turns on intention, the intention of state actors. And let's be clear that when we're talking about genocide, we do not use it as a strategy of moral disqualification of a state or group of people. Because there's some weird way in which genocide has lost its legal meaning entirely and become a device to essentially delegitimize the people you accuse it of. And so let's just be very clear what this concept is. Let's use it, in my view. It has legal meaning, so let's assess the facts in terms of the legal meaning of this thing, as opposed to some other use of it. Well, I'm right at the edge there, right? And then some people think, what are you saying to us here? Are you trying to give Israel a free pass here, boss? That kind of stuff. So I don't want to have a classroom disinfested of controversy.
Right.
That's the other problem, because there is a way of playing it so safe you never go to places. But try and keep us in fact-based reality to the best you can.
It was a very hard question, because obviously asking that question might deny the very sort of legitimacy of someone's experience in the classroom at that moment.
Sure.
Even allowing the question to be asked, right? Sure. So you're in a really difficult...
But I also don't believe it's my job to protect students. I have no interest in protecting students. Some of what we talk about is extremely painful.
Okay.
And so
we found something we disagree on.
Yeah, anyway.
All right, so let's talk about that one last minute, and then we'll go, because this was my last question. So the Chicago Principal Statement says, although the university greatly values civility and all members of the university share in the responsibility for maintaining a climate of mutual respect, concerns about civility and mutual respect can never be used as a justification for closing off discussions of ideas, however offensive or disagreeable those ideas may be to some members of our community. And so we in our statement disagreed with that, because there's evidence from, again, my friend Eli, that it is not just about the ability to participate. It's also about sort of the courage to participate. And so there can be a distinction among the people who grab the microphone. You want everyone to get a chance at the microphone, not to have some people hogging it in the free expression of ideas. So that would be a push back against I'm not worried about hurting students' feelings. I wouldn't be worried about students' feelings if I knew I could reliably hurt them all evenly. I think I would be fine. But if I'm only going to hurt some people's feelings some of the time, that might make me more concerned.
Yes. This is why teaching is a wonderful profession, because you're flirting with danger and hurt. When I said I don't care about whether I hurt students, of course I care.
No, I know.
Of course I care. But I actually don't think it's my job to protect them from opinions that they really object to, opinions that really hurt them, offend them. I think I can think of all kinds of cases where we've talked about things where I can tell there's a kind of stony look of people armoring themselves up against stuff they really don't want to hear. But I think that there's a kind of disrespect. That's my point. There's a kind of disrespect in the implication that a professor should protect students from hurt. everybody who comes into a classroom is an adult. Every person who comes into a classroom is an agent. Your point is well taken that this is differential. Not everybody, and some people feel silenced, shamed, etc., etc. And you do your best to make sure that it's inclusive in the real sense of, I want to hear what you have to say. If you don't want to say anything, I understand. Blah, blah. You do all that. But I've had very painful discussions. I've had people in tears. I mean, it's just that's life, and that's universities, I think, doing what they have to do. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. I've been fascinated by this kind of conversation. I could sit here much longer, but I'm at the same time thinking I want to bring other voices in.
Yeah, please.
In the spirit of this kind of frank and high-level discussion, we have a microphone that we can use so that we hear you properly, and also those on the screen following us can hear us properly. But I invite you for another 15 minutes to go ask Michael, but also Erin, perhaps, and continue that conversation from your point of view. So if you do have a question, I will try and take you as many as I can. So I've got two right here. We'll start there and then to the gentleman in the back. I'll take those two at a time, and then we'll stop and take another round.
Thank you very much. This was a fantastic talk, so I'm very inspired, and I think it's very empowering to think, what can we do to defend these values in our society? I want to briefly describe two real-life issues we have in Britain, in British academia, and I was just wondering if you wanted to say something about it, because it touches on freedom of speech and academic freedom. The one has already been touched on, the trans debate about if a man feels like a woman, does this mean they are a woman, etc. So I don't want to go into the debate. The question is, who decides who the experts are on the topic? And this has been really touched on already. And as a psychologist, I would actually say psychologists are a bit of experts in that field. But there are so many discussions, and has been so much criticism, what kind of academics chip in. So who gets to decide whose field it is? And the second issue is we've had quite a few problems here, especially in the last couple of weeks, with pro-Palestine students shutting down events, trying to stop an event at LSE on sexual violence against hostages. There have been issues, I think, in the last couple of days also here at UCL, where an event was shut down. They tried to go after an academic just because he's Israeli in, I think it's City University. And so basically I feel this is a scenario where we have got freedom of speech of the protesters, and I absolutely support the right to protest. I've joined many protests in the past, also on campus. But then on the other hand, if you shut down an academic, that, infringes on their academic freedom. And I think it's a bit of a dilemma. And I was wondering what your thoughts were on this. Thank you very much.
Just there at the back row. Yes.
Oh, hello. A fascinating talk, Professor. But my point is perhaps following on from the one made by the lady there. Early on, you were very emphatic that academic freedom is not the same as freedom of speech. But the point is, you can't have academic freedom unless you have a general culture of freedom of speech around it. And we had a classic example of that in Britain a couple of years back, when a professor at the University of Sussex, Kathleen Stock, resigned because she was effectively hounded out of her job by a student rebelling against her, which I trust you would regard as an unacceptable example of mob rule. But as I said, they are in. I accept your distinction, but freedom of speech and academic freedom are surely organically linked and can't be separated.
Michael, I think if you're willing to take both, all three of those questions to begin with, and we'll take another round.
I think it's clearly true. Academic freedom is dependent upon a free speech culture, no question. My point is that academic freedom, academic speech is speech uttered under the presumption of academic authority, as opposed to free speech, which is not uttered under the presumption of any authority other than personal belief, personal opinion. And that's why academic freedom is distinct. The presumption here is that when you open your mouth as an academic, you're speaking on the basis of your competence as an academic. And to the degree that academics forget that, they compromise their authority. And that's the point I'm trying to make there. Who decides who the experts are is a very good question and an urgent question in all areas, but particularly in areas of gender and sexuality. No question about it. And academics have to be careful it's part of the scholarly enterprise to listen to a lot of people. I mean, I don't know how to put it. I mean, my own experience of the trans phenomenon has been decisively shaped by the fact that one of the great historians in my field happens to be a person who made a gender transition, and now it has been for decades now a respected academic in my field. So she comes to see me all the time, and I've learned much more about this issue from her than I have from a lot of academic reading. So I just think any responsible academic has an obligation to listen very carefully to those who have been through the experience. I guess that's all I would say. And their authority is dependent on who they listen to, who they respected, who they've talked to. And those who've been through these personal experiences obviously also have the authority of personal experience, and so must be heard and listened to. I think that's all I'll say on that for the moment. But thank you both for the questions and comments.
Sure. Thank you. So I'm going to take a second round. I'm starting with a student right in the second row here. And then just here in the second row as well, on the other end.
Thank you very much for the discussion. I always appreciate Canadian representation as someone who's from same hometown as Ralph Goodale, which is a reference that I think only you and I are getting. I'm very interested in the discussion that you and Aaron had on output and impact versus authority as it relates specifically to matters of economics and justifying academia in economic terms as opposed to self-evident terms. Do you feel there is an imperative to say that academia is an institution that justifies itself, not just because we contribute workers who do well or because we advance scientific causes, but because it is a hub of social progress, of innovation? And I think that in some ways might get at some of the discussion that we've already been having on newer generations, and particularly my generation of students, young people who see academia as an institution, as an establishment that, as you've said, often reflects other inequalities, socioeconomic, racial, etc. And the confounding of these things together, how it can be a positive and a negative influence on the perception of academia overall. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If you want to hand on the mic to the other end, and we'll take a second question as well, just to the gentleman here. And may I just add, to somebody who teaches the EU, a question on output legitimacy is always welcome.
Thank you. In current circumstances, I find myself thinking a great deal about character, listening to individuals, thinking about institutions. For Heraclitus, and for the Greeks, character was destiny. As institutions and as individuals, do we think enough about character? And if we thought more about it, what would or should we do about that? Thank you.
Fantastic. Two very different questions. And Erin, if you do want to come in as well, then please do. But Michael.
The character question is tremendously interesting. I do think as a teacher, I'm in the character formation business, and that's very perilous. That is, I think I can teach students to care about being consequential when they speak and think, and that's a piece of character. I think I can teach them not to say any damn thing that comes into their mouth for the sake of making a noise. I think I can do my best to teach them to listen as much as they talk, and all of those things have a consequence for character. But I'm not their parents. I'm not their. My authority is limited, in other words, in relation to character. And so I'm skeptical about the ways in which pedagogy overreaches and becomes a kind of form of moral imperialism in a way. I try and confine my character forming aspects to essentially the epistemological side. That is, here's how to make a good argument. This is a bad argument. This is a good one. This is why you should listen. This is why, all those kind of things. I think I can have an impact on character because I've always been, there's a wonderful remark, a chilling remark made, I think, by Sartre, which is, rules are for people without character. It's a great remark. That is, you can't keep communities together. You can't keep institutions together unless there's some character formation and character values that we all share. Rules can't hold a characterless community together. So that's why, but again, character formation must be self-limiting. Otherwise it becomes a kind of tyranny. And so that what I'd say about that. To my Canadian friend, I think all I could offer is a sense of the challenge of it. I said earlier, that any discussion of academic freedom is a mirror turned against us. That not all institutions have to be reflexive. I mean, Amazon or, a company or a law firm or something doesn't have to be particularly reflexive. It doesn't have to constantly assess its practice. It doesn't constantly have to ask the question whether it's just or unjust. You raise the issue of justice. It is a characteristic of the university. Once you sign on to being a university, you're committed to permanent reflexive interrogation of whether you're living up to the ideals that you practice. That's what's on the can. You haven't got a choice. And do we succeed? No. I mean, do we fail constantly? And I will not repeat Beckett at you, fail better. I'll spare you that. But that's a thing I've discovered about universities, which is, I think, one of the best things about it. Also extremely infuriating, especially if you run a university. There's always somebody coming up to you in the hall and saying, how can you violate the principles that this institution holds? I mean, and the goddamn problem is that they're right often, right? But that's the nature of what these institutions are at their best. And they they generate a kind of a micro practice, which I've come to admire. You walk down the hall to have a coffee with a guy who's just come out of his class, and he said, I didn't have it today. I didn't land it, and living in an institution where people care about whether they landed the class or didn't land it is why you love these institutions. So it's a kind of oblique attempt to answer your question.
It might be another angle on character, though. I was surprised that you answered about character formation, because so much of what we've talked about is actually your character in how you approach your classroom and the character that leaders need and how to balance these incredibly difficult, challenging questions. And so it seems to me that the university has to be thinking about the character of its academics and of its administrators, even before we get to the character formation of its students, because you might be better placed to solve that problem if you have the committed pedagogues, the committed academic researchers, the people that are focused on their authority, and all of the things that you have put out as sort of the best case academic community. How do we create that institutionally? Yeah. And you may, in fact, need some rules on that side. Yes. Or you have to be really good at judging character in short interviews.
Indeed.
So we have, I'm going to take two more, just the very, very end. May I ask you to be brief? The gentleman here has been very patient. And we also have one here, and that'll be the last two that I'm taking, because we also have Michael Spence offering some closing remarks before we're going to wrap. So please.
Thanks. Hi, my memory may be false, but just a correction. I'm not here to defend or whitewash the AEI, but I think we should blame the Heritage Foundation for Project 2025.
Yes.
But my question was, I sensed possibly a tension in your very excellent talk between saying on the one hand that what universities said in public on public matters didn't matter, and on the other hand, they were culturally so powerful, universities. And I wonder whether one line of possible resolution would be to look more exactly at what universities are by way of cultural institutions. Very quickly, if I look at the United States and the great universities, what are they? They're great law schools, great medical schools, great science schools, and the generators of public discourse and public controversy are very small parts of them. But I sense that tension in your talk.
Fantastic, thank you. And just over here as well, and cycle back to you.
Thanks so much. I enjoyed your exchange, the two of you, right at the end about this part of the Chicago statement that concerns respect and civility and whether it can ever set a constraint on what happens in the classroom. Like Aaron, I'm skeptical of the Chicago statement or critical of it. Here's how I'd put it. It's not that what it says on that point is strictly wrong, but that it plays into the idea that the kind of the respective ideals that are being set in contrast with each other there stand in some kind of fundamental conflict. So here's how I think about it. I want to be a really, really excellent teacher. I want every student to think my class was their favorite class they did at uni. And there's no way to do that unless I'm 100% consistently intellectually serious and I'm never taking subjects off the table and saying, that's a minefield, we're not going to go there. And at the same time, always maximally civil and respectful and getting them to be civil and respectful with each other. So what I object to in the Chicago statement is that it invites us to think, and it plays into the narrative that we have to choose between civility and respect on one hand and kind of intellectual honesty, intellectual seriousness, going to the difficult places on the other. I mean, if you want to be a great teacher, you've always got to do both.
Well, for once I can be concise in my answer to the last question. My answer is here. The question, I think you've exposed there are many contradictions in what I said, but I think you put your finger on one that's especially interesting. I've said on the one hand, we have to understand why universities are under attack. One reason that they're under attack is they're damn powerful. And then I've said, but nothing universities say collectively makes a dime's bit of difference. Square the circle. Good, very, very good point. Clearly, one of the reasons they've gone after Harvard is that every time Harvard puts out a pronunciamento of any kind, it gets coverage in the New York Times. And I think I wasn't sufficiently clear that a pronunciamento by Harvard in the New York Times doesn't make a damn bit of difference anyway, would be what I go on to say. In terms of, I'm strongly skeptical of the political efficacy or impact of university statements. But that is, in my view, not in contradiction of the fact that they're extremely important and powerful institutions. You made the useful distinction that their power is in the law schools, the med schools, the business schools, the that's where the wealth is, that's where the power is, and also in the science, and tremendously in the science field. The stuff that's getting the noise and it drives the scientists crazy is all this us humanities guys talking a lot of nonsense. I mean, that's the stuff that makes academics, the scientists, furious. I mean, it's visceral. You're a physicist running a lab, and you're getting punished because of some, demonstration about Gaza that's cut, $50 million out of your lab. And so these are the kind of issues that are dividing the university. And when universities phone me and ask me for advice, one of the things they talk about first is the incredible tension between the scientific side of these universities and the humanities side, because I feel the humanities side have, lost the appropriate discipline and restraint that you need to sustain massive investments in science. I think that's I'm pretty sympathetic to what the science men and women are saying back to the humanities. But that's again another issue, and it's a challenge to university leadership to hold the two communities together, and not throw the humanities guys overboard simply because occasionally they say damn stupid things. Anyway.
The challenge to university leadership, there couldn't have been a more perfect segue over from this really high-level discussion.
Well, I have another challenge, and my particular challenge, Michael, is that you said that we shouldn't go out into the night feeling good about universities. And as you did that, you warmly hugged yourself. And of course, that gives me two challenges. The first is that it's the job of the person who moves the most vote of thanks to make everybody go out into the night feeling warm about themselves and about the university. And second, that this evening I did actually feel warm about the university because of this particular conversation. So universities are, as you say, ancient institutions. Now, I quibble about the continuity of the university as an institution. You mentioned Padova, for example, fabulous institution, run by the students for much of its history, who every year hired the lecturers and only rehired the good teachers, also voted for the rectors every year and appointed them by a committee of students. So much to recommend to the University of Padova. And yet universities have fulfilled all of these different social functions, but this, again and again and again, we kept coming back to the historic role of the university as a place that values a particular kind of freedom. And in particular, a particular kind of intellectual freedom, yet constrained in all sorts of ways, hedged in all sorts of ways, but freedom, and more than that. And I dare not say it because for much of my academic career, it was a swear word so much that when I mentioned it and the relentless pursuit for it, in my opening oration at my last address, I got a lot of people saying it was a slightly edged truth. Truth that for most of their history have been concerned with the relentless search for a particular kind of intellectual freedom in the service of a pursuit for the true. By the time I gave my parting oration at my last gig, I was bold enough to say, for the true, the good, and beautiful. Let's wait. Let's leave that to one side. So you left me with a very strong sense of the value of the university as a place of intellectual freedom and as a place where people take this notion of truth seriously. And yet, you'll be glad to know you didn't leave me too comfortable. And the reason that you didn't leave me too comfortable is because it's just difficult. At almost every turn of this conversation, you saw how difficult it is to live those particular commitments in complex social contexts and with all the massive contradictions that there are inside universities as institutions and in the way that they relate to broader economic, political, and social power, in the way that they operate in the communities that they serve. And so you'll be glad to know that I leave the university, that I leave this evening, yes, feeling slightly reassured about my institutions more generally, that I leave the university, that I leave this evening troubled about the complexities of these issues with which, in our different roles, whether student, member of staff, head of department, dean, leader of a university, whatever it might be, we grapple. And understanding that they are difficult and yet inspired to keep going. And so for that, Michael, I do, on behalf of the HISIA, on behalf of the Institute and the Disagreeing Well program, just offer you our very, very thanks.